Welcome to African History Times. This is our third and final installment on the history of Zambia. We recommend that you check out parts 1 and parts 2 before getting into part 3. Like most African countries at independence, the joys and celebrations of Zambia's freedom were relatively short-lived. Zambia faced major challenges at independence, especially to do with the skills and the know-how of running a modern economy, which made it difficult for Zambia to leverage her mineral wealth by herself. Also, when Zambia and many other African countries obtained their freedom, there was a Cold War conflict going on between the USA and the Soviet Union, aka Russia. This made for a very hostile international environment, where newly formed countries had to choose between communism or capitalism, or else be ignored by the two economic blocs that had the funds to assist the new country. The fact that most of Zambia's neighbors were still living under colonial rule didn't make things easier for Zambia. Zambia's still European-ruled neighbors didn't look kindly upon Zambia. Her independence was an unwanted example, and it was a threat to the colonial power structures. As we will see later, Zambia made things worse for herself as she sought to support the African countries that were still laboring under colonialization. Although such deeds are commendable, Zambia suffered for these actions. Here is one example of this. Zambia adopted a policy of not trading through the main line, supply route, and line of rail to the sea, which would have meant conducting trade through the territory of Zambia's neighboring country of Southern Rhodesia, aka Zimbabwe. This cost the Zambian economy greatly. Enter Mr. Kaunda. He was Zambia's big man. Zambia was not unique in Africa when it came to the problem of big men. Mr. Kaunda became a prime minister at first. In 1968, he was elected president. His whole thing was about centralized planning and nationalization, and he was inspired by the socialism of Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. Say what you want to say about these policies. What history shows us is that most policies shouldn't be judged at face value. It's always about the details of the actual implementation. The devil is in the details, as the saying goes. One result of the socialist communist ideology of the time was the one-party state. Zambia became a one-party state in 1972. All other political parties except for the United National Independence Party, the UNIP, were banned. This was then put into law in the Constitution of 1973. With the UNIP being the only game in town politically, and Kenneth Kaunda at the helm of state, what this meant in practice was that Zambia was a so-called one-party participatory democracy, which apparently means that Zambia regarded herself as a democracy, but a democracy that had just one party. Among the explanations given for the state of affairs was that a one party could help to enforce or to encourage national unity. Indeed, historically, national unity has been a concern for new countries, or in cases where the countries are facing a severe crisis. Even going back to ancient times, the Roman Republic, for instance, would nominate a dictator to rule alone during tough times, especially during times of war. But this dictator was allowed to stay in power for only 6 months. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Communist Party there instituted one-party rule. Germany also instituted one-party rule in 1933 in response to grave economic distress and the national chaos that resulted from her losing the First World War. These latter two examples of one-party rule are not flattering at all, as the Russian and German experiments in that area turned out to be a disaster. The China of today has been a one-party state since the 1940s. As far as how China has done overall as a one-party state, historians are still arguing about that. But from a purely economic standpoint, Few can argue today against China's outstanding economic performance. In the beginning, though, until about 20 years ago, economically China was looking like a failed state. Not to mention that China gets a very low score from experts when it comes to issues such as labor rights, human rights, and such other related issues. There was a point in time when one-party rule was all the rage in Africa amongst the newly independent countries. Zambia followed on the one-party rule footsteps of such countries as Ghana and Tanzania. We have already stated how much Kenneth Kaunda looked up to Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. As for Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, who instituted one-party rule in Ghana in the 1960s, as recently as 2017, Kenneth Kaunda was advising the then newly elected president of Ghana to follow the example of Nkrumah. This means that Kaunda still believed in the one-party state 50 years later. This isn't to give excuses on behalf of Kaunda, but when well-respected leaders are following a certain path, it's easy to see why a new leader like Kaunda would seek to emulate the people who came before him, especially Nkrumah, who at the time was like a god to many highly regarded Africans and among the African diaspora, a status Nkrumah still holds today among many Africans. We must, however, remember that back in the early 1970s, these political and economic ideas had not been well tested and assessed in the African context. So how did Zambia do as a one-party state? Spoiler alert, the fact that Zambia had to unceremoniously drop one-party rule in 1991 should give you a clue. To be sure, it's difficult to ascertain if the problems below were as a result of one-party rule or were the result of something else. So please don't think that we are making a link between these problems and one-party rule. Maybe these problems would have occurred anyway. After all, it is very difficult to determine why in any given country things end up the way they do. Countries are very complicated systems with many factors affecting different aspects at different times. Besides, it should be noted that unlike Ghana and Tanzania, who did not incorporate a substantial Bill of Rights in their one-party states, Zambia did the opposite. At least on paper, the one-party system in Zambia did contain vastly significant Bill of Rights provisions. So Kaunda and the UNIP should at the least be extolled for attempting to limit the power of the Zambian state, something that their African counterparts were not doing at the time. However, this did not stop Zambia from becoming a state where political opponents were harassed. Many people did express disappointment and dissatisfaction with the way things were going, and they suffered for that. State intelligence agents infiltrated society. Torture became rampant. Unjust imprisonment occurred. The economic system of Zambia hit the doldrums, while the education system suffered very negatively. Some historians have even stated that during the one-party period, the Zambian government misrepresented and skewed the writing of Zambia's colonial era history and the history of the Zambian struggle for freedom. All this has led some authors to claim that the one-party state in Zambia, though disguised as an exercise in national unity, was mainly implemented because the powers that be realized early on that they could not sort out the economy and other problems, and thus they wanted to preemptively suppress the political opposition that they thought would result from those failures. And now moving on to something more positive. One of the great injustices of the modern era has to do with the minimal attention that has been paid to Zambia's role in helping independence movements across Africa. Knowledgeable Zambians know how much their country assisted other African countries in their respective struggles for freedom. Take the example of South Africa, for instance. The African National Congress, the ANC, which is still the governing party in the country of South Africa, and famous worldwide as the Party of Nelson Mandela, had its headquarters in Zambia during apartheid. The ANC military wing had its main military training camps in Zambia. While the Zambian government provided some of the funding, training, and of course shelter. Because of this, the then apartheid government of South Africa bombed and harassed Zambia. Zambia was by no means rich, but that did not stop her from supporting other African nations in their time of need. Zambia assisted countries like Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, Angola, and others. When Zambia became free on the 24th of October 1964, she had significant mineral wealth. But due to colonial era policies, she had few trained and educated Zambians capable of running the government. The economy was dependent on foreign expertise. This state of affairs is not unique to Zambia. When countries get free after a long period of oppression, they face huge challenges with things like skills and know-how. To make things worse, when Zambia obtained freedom, like almost all African countries who obtained freedom during the Cold War period, getting help from the international community was a tricky proposition. Still, Zambia unselfishly helped, consoled, and assisted and offered shelter to other African independence movements, to her own detriment. In conclusion, like many African countries who came out of the European colonial rule, Zambia was not immune to pre-independence turmoil. Turmoil largely driven by the African population's desire to shed European control. There was also post-independence instability, which stemmed from the lot of newly fangled African nations trying to run modern economies by themselves for the first time. The newly independent African countries had to try and traverse through political systems, in this case liberal democracy, and economic systems, capitalism in this case, that were left behind by their former European colonial masters. Zambia relied on loans from the International Monetary Fund and thus fell victim to the IMF's stringent demands concerning how Zambians should run their country. International aid and loans resulted in crippling outcomes for African countries. We have already mentioned that the Cold War between the USA and Russia didn't make things any easier for the newly independent African countries. The fact that the Zambian government had some socialist leanings did not render Zambia a darling of the West. It did not help that the newly independent African countries were based on arbitrary borders, contained multiple tribes, languages, and cultural groups. In many of these cases, the tribes who found themselves belonging within the same borders had never operated as a unit before colonization and were not very keen to do so after colonization. Like so many other African countries, Zambia also fell into the unfortunate situation of having one ruler for far too long. By the 1990s, significant unrest from the populace helped to bring Zambia back into being a multi-party democracy. Kenneth Kaunda lost his seat as a ruler. After the Kaunda regime, from 1991 onwards, subsequent Zambian governments began to institute limited reforms. Though the economy stagnated until the late 1990s, in the year 2007, Zambia recorded its ninth consecutive year of economic growth. Inflation was 8.9%, down from 30% in the year 2000. Things seemed to stabilize a bit. By the 2000s, there was even some economic success. But then, the 2008 international economic downturn impacted negatively upon Zambia's economic potential. In 2011, for instance, Zambia withdrew its bid to host the 2011 All Africa Games, citing a lack of funds. It is estimated that approximately 60% of the population lives below the poverty line. Zambia is still dealing with economic reform issues, such as the size of the public sector and improving social delivery systems. Like many African countries, Zambia relies on minerals and mining. But unlike the oil producing countries in the Middle East, for instance, African countries generally do not have control of their own minerals. Agriculture plays a very important part in Zambia's economy, providing many more jobs than the mining industry. Zambia farms a variety of crops, including corn, tobacco, wheat, and chili peppers. The economic reforms under the late Zambian president, Levi Mwanamwasa, have been credited with stimulating an agricultural boom in Zambia. In 2004, for the first time in over 2 decades, Zambia exported more corn than it imported. In December 2019, the Zambian government unanimously decided to legalize cannabis for medicinal and export purposes only. The Zambian government is pursuing an economic diversification program to reduce the country's reliance on the copper industry. Such initiatives seek to exploit other components of Zambia's rich resource base by promoting agriculture, tourism, gemstone mining, and hydropower. We have arrived at the end of our History of Zambia. We hope you enjoyed the History of Zambia series. Please subscribe to get the latest content from us.